Today we are going to be talking about two societies at war between the years 1861 and 1865. This is basically known as the Civil War, the North versus the South, Union versus Confederacy. This is going to be Chapter 14. Now, it starts off with secession and military stalemate. A secession means to separate, to leave. And that's exactly what happened. The Union collapsed first in South Carolina in December 20th or on December 20th, 1860. South Carolina seceded. They left and said, we no longer are going to belong to the United States of America. Mobs started to attack Union supporters in the South. So people who were supporting the North were being physically attacked. By January 1861, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas all seceded and left the United States of America. In February of 1861, the secessionists met to proclaim the Confederate States of America. So these states left and became literally their own country called the Confederate States of America. They created their own government. They had their own president. That president's name was Jefferson Davis. The Middle South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, they didn't have as much of a desire to secede as others, but there still was a little bit of a desire among some of the people there. President Buchanan urged Congress, he was the president at the time, to find a compromise. So they tried this Crittenden Compromise. The first part said that there was an amendment to protect slavery from federal interference in any state where it already existed. And then the second part had to do with westward extension of the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the California border. So that was the Crittenden Compromise, to have an amendment that would protect slavery from the federal government getting involved and extending that Missouri Compromise line that we have talked about. Obviously, we know that Crittenden Compromise isn't going to work. Here we can see the blue is the North, the red is the Confederate, yellow are border states not really involved, and the black, the territories, they're there, but their involvement is pretty minimal. You're going to eventually, Nevada becomes influential. Abraham Lincoln needs our gold and our silver, so we break some rules and become a state in 1864, if my memory serves me right. Now we have the secession crisis. Here in March 1861, Lincoln's inaugural address. Lincoln, his first speech as President of the United States, he says, we will protect slavery where it existed, but he's not going to let it expand. Okay, you have slavery where it is, that's fine, we'll deal with that, but slavery will not expand. He said that the Union is perpetual, meaning we are together, we're guaranteed together, and that by those states seceding or leaving it is illegal. Hold, occupy, and possess federal property in the seceded states. April 12th, 1861, you get one of the first battles of the Civil War. Battle of Fort Sumter lasts 2 days. April 15th, Lincoln calls 75,000 state militiamen into federal service for 90 days. The reason he only did 90 days is he thought that's how long the war was going to last. He said every man must be for the United States or against it. There can be no neutrals in this war, only patriots or traitors, said Stephen Douglas. We need to get involved and pick a side in this war. The border states that we saw a second ago now had to choose which side they were going to join in. Virginia chose South, October 1861. Northwest Virginia voted to create a breakaway territory. So that is how Virginia and West Virginia were created, was over the Civil War. Here we have Fort Sumter. It's basically a fort, an island outside of Charleston. And it was a northern Union fort, and the Confederates just bombed it, and eventually they lost. Now, Jefferson Davis, President of the South. White Southerners fighting for the sacred right of self-government. All we ask is to be left alone. But the mentality was that these whites in the South were fighting for their freedom, for their liberties, for the things that were their livelihood. The Confederate Constitution ruled out any law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves. So the Confederate States of America Constitution said that there would be no way to deny or impair the right of property as far as slaves go. So they were going to be property forever. Lincoln insisted on an aggressive military campaign to help restore the Union, and they decided to quickly attack Richmond, which would mean that the war was over. Well, as we know, that's not going to ultimately happen. You had 30,000 Union versus 20,000 Confederate at the Battle of Bull Run. The Confederates counterattacked with what was known as a rebel yell, and it was something they yelled, a vocal thing that they yelled, and it said, quote here, "The peculiar corkscrew sensation that it sends down your backbone can never be told." That scream was very fearful to the Union soldiers. Next, you get the Battle of Antietam. The Confederate went on the offensive, fighting was savage, bloodiest single day in U.S. military history. The Union desired to control Ohio, Mississippi, Missouri rivers. If they controlled those rivers, the reason being the Confederates would not be able to have access, and their trade would be even limited even more. The Battle of Shiloh, so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk over the clearing in any direction, stepping on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground. Everywhere you looked, everywhere you went during the Civil War, there were bodies. Now, towards total war. By 1862, the war, they realized was going to be long and costly, so they started a total war. They mobilized all of society's resources, economic, political, cultural, everything was involved in the war. At first, it was all about war, war, war. Later on, people kind of not as supportive of the war. The Confederates started a draft or conscription, and they would pick men between the ages of 18 and 35, and they had to serve for the duration of the war. There were at least 3 years military service from all men. In the South, one white man for every 20 slaves was exempted. So if you lived, your daddy was rich and you had a bunch of slaves, 100 slaves, 5 sons could be exempted from the war. You could also hire substitutes in the South. The rich man's war and a poor man's fight. So if you were rich and your son was selected for the draft or conscription, you could just hire somebody else to go in his stead. The Union put taxes on draft resistors to Confederate sympathizers and imprisoned them. The drafting the poor whites to liberate enslaved blacks who would then take their jobs. So this mentality of trying to draft these whites that didn't have money to help free the slaves when the slaves were doing their jobs. It was pretty chaotic. Diseases and infections killed about 250,000 Union and Confederate soldiers, give or take. 135 died in combat in the Union. Death changed society. You basically had a whole generation of young men between the ages of 18 and 35 that died. They also started to embalm, which preserved the body, cemeteries and mourning. And women were involved in the war. You had a woman by the name of Clara Barton who said at the war's end, women was at least 50 years in advance of the normal position which continued peace world would have assigned her. So women were being involved and were being treated more fairly. A lot of the Civil War was brother versus brother, family versus family. So here you can see two brothers very similarly looked, but one for the Union, one for the Confederate. Here we can see some signs trying to promote and recruit people to volunteer for the war. Now, up here in the top left, we can see a woman. And what's interesting is there were some female soldiers who dressed as men in order to be able to fight. Down at the bottom right is another woman, her involvement as a nurse. So women were truly involved and influential within the Civil War. Now, here we can see Union versus Confederacy. Union in that pinkish, the purplish blue, and then the gray in the Confederacy. So if you look at population, 71% of the Union. Factories, 91% Union. Railroads, 71%. Iron, 94%. Farm, 75%. Wheat, 81%. Cotton, the Union only had 4%. Wealth, 75%. Free men in military service, 25%. By looking at all those, this war should have been quick. It should have been over. But despite the Confederates not having everything they needed, they were able to accomplish many incredible things just because of their desire, their will to survive. Now, the Union enacted a government-assisted economic development program which put high tariffs or taxes, 40% taxes, on things being shipped in from other countries. They gave free land to farmers. The banks turned federal, and the Union also was working on this transcontinental railroad, the ability for a railroad to go from ocean to ocean, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And that was hugely influential in the Union being able to get the necessary resources and supplies and finances. By 1860, they spent $63 million was spent by the government. By 1864, they spent $865 million spent by the government to help pay for this war. The Confederate resorts to coercion and inflation in order to get the finances and the people needed for the war. They refused to tax cotton. exports, and slaves. That would have been a huge moneymaker for the Confederates, but they knew that if they taxed the one thing that this whole war, one of the things that this war was about, that people would be upset and the support for the war would greatly diminish. 60% of the war was paid just by printing money. Now, that's called inflation, and that's a problem. Because if you just keep printing money, printing money, printing money, eventually the money becomes worthless. So, for instance, if you were to just keep printing money, something that cost $1 or the $5 hot and ready at Little Caesars would now cost $12. If all of a sudden you're spending or printing money, it's called inflation. Your money doesn't go as far. By 1861 to 1865, prices rose 92%. And there we can see price in dollars, how much things cost. In 1861 it started out at $1, but by 1865 it was costing the same item would cost $92, and that's a huge problem. By 1863 there was a turning point. There were slaves that were reaching the Union camp. There was enemy property that was seized and not returned. By April 1862, Washington, D.C. outlawed slavery and compensated its owners. So if you had slaves in Washington, D.C., they would pay you and the slaves would become free. You had the Second Confiscation Act, forever free. If the Union soldiers or Union Army captured you, then those slaves would be free forever. Lincoln said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. The slavery is not the reason that we went to the Civil War. The reason we went to the Civil War is to keep the United States together. But as the war switched, or as it progressed, our purpose for fighting the Civil War switched, and it was ultimately to free the slaves. The proclamation legally abolished slavery in all states that remained out of the Union on January 1st, 1863. And that proclamation is known as the Emancipation Proclamation. That word emancipate means to free, and a proclamation means to speak, or a speech. But by January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation guaranteed that all slaves that were out of the Union would be free. Well, the problem with that is Lincoln, the president of the Union, was telling the Confederate States of America what to do. It would be as if Canada's president told America what to do. The Confederate States of America did not listen to what they had to say. And so ultimately, no slaves were really freed on January 1st, 1863. Now, some other battles, Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Battle of Gettysburg, one of the more famous battles of the Civil War. July 1863, the Union took control of the entire Mississippi. General Grant split the Confederacy into two. At the Battle of Gettysburg, it was a very decisive confrontation, militarily, politically, and diplomatically. Here you can see a map of the Battle of Gettysburg. The blue would be the Union, the red would be the Confederate. Very, very deadly battle within just a few days. Here we can see an artist rendition. There on the right, we can see the United States flag. There on the left, the Confederate States flag. But ultimately, through all these battles, through all this thing, despite the the Confederate having this strong desire to succeed, ultimately, the Union is going to end up being victorious. By 1861, the freed African Americans and fugitive slaves were helping to fight in the war. By 1865, nearly 200,000 African Americans were soldiers for the Union, for the North. Lincoln said, without black soldiers, we would be compelled to abandon the war in 3 weeks. So even though they weren't treated equally, even though they had all of these societal problems and differences, they were hugely influential in the success of the Civil War. By March 1864, General Ulysses S. Grant was put in charge of all the Union armies, and he was willing to accept heavy casualties. Now, a casualty means a soldier who is killed, wounded, or lost during battle. And Grant, his philosophy was, if we want to win, it's going to cost a lot of bodies. It's going to cost a lot of casualties. 1864, we have an election, and we also have General Sherman's March to the Sea. September 2nd, 1864, Atlanta fell to Sherman's army. Atlanta is in the far south. Sherman's is helping out with the Union. Lincoln won a re-election in 1864, And the Union troops were doing well. The Republicans were doing well. By the end of 1864, legal emancipation. So the legal freeing of slaves started to happen in Maryland, Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana. January 1865, we get the 13th Amendment, which said neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime wherever the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So, January 1865, slavery is illegal. Yet William Tecumseh Sherman, okay? He had fought a hard war, and he said, when one nation is at war with another, all the people of one are enemies of the other. Now, what he meant there was whether you're a soldier or not, if you're the Confederate States of America, we're at war with you. So his march to the sea was 300 miles, and along that march to the sea, he consumed or demolished everything in its path. Churches, schools, homes, buildings, farms, factories, anything and everything he destroyed. The reason was he wasn't at war just with the soldiers of the Confederate States. He was at war with everyone in the Confederate States, all of the people, the citizens. The Confederates had mass desertions. Their soldiers were leaving. In 1865, 100,000 soldiers left. And eventually General Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. So here we can see a picture of the 13th Amendment reflecting it. We've already talked about that in class. Here we have Sherman's March to the Sea, all the way from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. Remember, destroying everything. And then here we have General Lee surrendering at Appomattox Courthouse. Now, the outcome, the effect, the end of the Civil War. If we take all of the other battles that America has been involved in, and all of the soldiers that have died in all the other wars and battles, there were still more soldiers alone in the Civil War than all of the other wars and battles and death combined. If we look at, that's the bottom chart. If we look at the top chart, we can see by state, Virginia, North Carolina, 30,000, Alabama, 28,000. Massive amounts of deaths within the United States. Like I said earlier, it completely changed a whole time period, a whole generation of American history, of the history of the United States. Casualties, remember casualties, dead, injured, or lost. Total troops in the Union, they had 1.5 million Union troops. The Confederate had just over 1 million. Wounded, 275,000, and approximately 194,000 for the Confederate. Died of wounds and died of disease. If we look at that, so we have wounded, died of wounds, died of disease. The disease were rampant. Now, that may have been they got shot in the arm, they had to cut off the arm, and they got gangrene or some other disease. But it was not pretty. And then here we can see some of the battles. Fort Sumter, first Battle of Bull Run, the attacks on Richmond, Virginia, Battle of Antietam, the second Battle of Bull Run, Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, Battle of Shiloh, Battle of New Orleans, Battle of Fredericksburg, Battle of Gettysburg, Chancellorsville Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, Petersburg, March to the Sea, Fort Fisher, Appomattox Courthouse. These are some of the key events and battles and locations throughout the Civil War. Now, the Civil War is something that you've heard a lot about. It's something you probably already know about. You learned it all throughout history, or all throughout school. When you talk about history, it's kind of one of the major turning points within the history of the entire United States. And the main thing to know is it happened between 1861 and 1865.